Next up, Stephan is an obesity researcher and neurobiologist who places cutting-edge biomedical science into an ancestral health framework. His research spans obesity, nutrition, and metabolic disease, but in recent years has been focused primarily on the neurobiology of eating behavior and obesity. Stephan is the sole author of the popular health blog Whole Health Source, and he's currently working on a book entitled The Hungry Brain, which explores why we often overeat despite our best intentions. And I've been a big fan of his blog for many years, so I'm really delighted to welcome him to the stage today.
Thank you. It's good to be here. Thank you for inviting me, Dr. Akil. And my name is Stephan Guillenet. I'm the poor fellow who has to follow up after Dr. Sonnenberg. It's a great talk. All right, let me get situated here. Okay, so I'm going to talk about something today that I personally find very interesting that I had the opportunity to explore as part of the research for my upcoming book. And this is the economics of eating. And when I say economics, I'm not really talking about money, although that's part of the equation. What I'm really talking about is the cost-benefit computations that are happening in the human brain that determine what we eat and how much we eat. So, we've got a big problem in this country. The latest CDC figures are in, and 38% of U.S. adults have obesity. This is approximately 3 times higher than the percentage back in the 1960s. And this is something that we call the obesity epidemic. But in fact, this is part of a longer-term trend that's been happening probably for the last century. So why do we weigh more than we used to? The most straightforward explanation is that we're eating more calories than we used to. Today we eat approximately 273 calories per day, more than we did around 1978 when the obesity epidemic came into full swing. So this is pretty extraordinary. I mean, we're talking about more than a 10% increase in calorie intake over the last 30, 40 years. So this is going to require some explaining, and I think there are a lot of different ways to explain this increase in calorie intake, but one of them is the innate economic logic of the human brain. And to understand this, we're going to have to take a step back and look at how natural selection generates food-seeking behavior. And we're going to talk about something called optimal foraging theory, and this is something that Rob brought up briefly in his presentation. So natural selection is very, very concerned with food. Simply put, an animal that is very good at getting food is going to survive longer and leave more offspring than an animal that's not very good at getting food. And because of that, natural selection selects very strongly for efficient food-seeking behaviors over evolutionary timescales. And interestingly, the principles that govern efficient food-seeking behaviors are relatively consistent, and because of that, they can be mathematically modeled, and they have been mathematically modeled. And biologists working in a variety of species have found that foraging behavior corresponds to principles that are modeled by this equation, which is called the optimal foraging equation. So this states that the value of pursuing a particular food resource is equal to the calories that you gain by pursuing that resource minus the calories that you expend pursuing that resource divided by the amount of time that it takes you to get it. So basically, what this formula says is that the value of a food is equal to its calorie return rate. And if there are any economists in the room, you might recognize this as a simple value or profit maximization equation. And the reason is not difficult to understand. It's because the same principles that govern efficient the same principles that maximize profit are the principles that maximize food acquisition in a natural environment. So even though a lioness does not understand economic theory, natural selection has shaped her brain to cause her to behave as if she understood this very equation. And this is true of a variety of species, not just lions, and one of those species is humans. So this is a man named Kim Hill. He's a professor of anthropology at Arizona State University, and he's one of the people who I spoke with for my book. And he has, for his entire career, he's been studying hunter-gatherer and horticultural populations in South America, and in particular one population called the Ache, which are hunter-gatherers. And one of the things that he's done over the course of his career is he's tried to see if this optimal foraging equation can predict the foraging behavior of human beings. And it turns out that the answer is yes. It actually predicts them remarkably well. So this is a quote from one of his papers. Energetic returns from foraging strategies is probably the best single predictor of foraging patterns. And this has been shown in several different hunter-gatherer groups. So basically, that calorie return rate that the optimal foraging equation predicts is the single most important component of what drives human beings in a natural environment to select one food resource over another. So if you're a hunter-gatherer in a wild environment and you have 100 different food resources that you could pursue, the one that it makes the most sense to pursue is the one that has the highest calorie return rate. So there are a lot of things that the optimal foraging equation does not take into account. So it doesn't take into account risk. For example, if you have to climb a tall tree to get fruit, it doesn't really take that into account. It doesn't take into account other nutritional properties of food, for example, the protein content of food. And Dr. Hill has actually shown that if you do incorporate food into the equation, you get a little bit better fit for the observations. There's culture, there's taboos, et cetera, that affect, our food-related decisions. But given the fact that the optimal foraging equation ignores so many things about eating, it nevertheless does a remarkable job of predicting what food resources people in a wild environment will actually select. And I think that points to the fact that as far as the intuitive preferences of the human brain are concerned, the instinctive, intuitive preferences, calories are king. And so if we go back to this equation, we can decompose this into two basic concepts. One of them is the benefits of food, and according to this equation, it's primarily calories. And the second one is the cost of food. How much time and effort does it cost to get a particular food, and how much money does it cost, which is an indirect representation of the time and effort required to earn the money. So the main point I want to make here is that the human brain is constantly weighing these costs and these benefits on a non-conscious level, and it's looking for a good deal. The brain is always looking for a good deal, whether it's a mortgage, whether it's a salary negotiation, or whether it's food. The brain is always looking for a way to get the maximum amount of benefit for the minimum cost. And so what happens when food is a really great deal? What happens when those benefits are really, really high and those costs are really, really low? So I asked several anthropologists about this, and this is what they told me. So Kim Hill told me that in one sitting, an Ache hunter-gatherer will eat up to 5 pounds of meat, especially if it's fatty, 20 to 30 wild oranges that are similar in size and sweetness to the ones that we get in grocery stores, or 1.5 liters of honey. That's about 1/3 of a gallon of straight honey in one sitting. Herman Ponser is a researcher who studies a hunter-gatherer group called the Hadza. This is a hunter-gatherer group in Tanzania. We heard about them a moment ago. And they are probably the closest living approximation we have to our Stone Age ancestors in the entire world. He told me the Hadza will sit down literally with a can full of honey and eat the whole thing. It's like taking one of those honey plastic bears that you get in the supermarket and drinking it like a glass of milk. I mean, that's pretty extraordinary. I mean, I don't even think I could do that. And then there's Brian Wood, who has spent even more time with the Hadza, and he told me the Hadza fully embrace the idea of eat as much pure fat as you can possibly eat. There's no hint of moderation whatsoever in their drives and motivations with eating food. And he went on to explain to me how the Hadza, kind of what they do after they kill an animal. And they are masters at evaluating the quality of the animal that they've just killed and where the best, parts of the animal are. So once they kill a large animal like a zebra, they'll pinch it in a bunch of places. They'll find the fattiest parts. They'll cut them off. They eat the whole thing, but they'll take those fatty parts, boil them down, and drink the soup. So basically, for a hunter-gatherer, it makes a lot of sense to do this. And I'll explain why in a moment. But this is what hunter-gatherers do, and this is probably what our ancestors did. So if hunter-gatherers are guzzling, fat and meat and sugar, why aren't they obese? Why are hunter-gatherers so lean? And I think it just boils down to energy balance. Even though they have periods, they have instances where they can gorge on these calorie-dense foods, most of the time they're not getting as many calories as they would like. They're not starving, but they're not getting quite as many calories as they would like. And if you speak to these anthropologists, what they'll tell you is that hunter-gatherers often report being hungry. If you ask them, are you hungry? They'll say, yes, I'm hungry. And so these opportunities to binge are opportunities to remain in energy balance and to not lose weight and to stay healthy and fertile in a difficult wild environment. And so this gorging, this binging is literally good for them. This helps them to survive and thrive in a difficult natural environment. So this is a healthy behavior for a hunter-gatherer, and I believe that this behavior of taking advantage of really good deals when they're available is something that's deeply wired into the human brain and something that triggers our own motivation to take advantage of the same types of situations. So if this is true, then all of this has to be happening in the brain. So how does that work? We're going to talk a little bit about the neuroscience of economic choice here. So if we go back to this optimal foraging equation, there's this concept of value. And this is a really important concept. Psychologists and economists have long known that people behave as if their brains were calculating the value of different options, like, for example, eating food A versus food B, comparing the value of those options, and then making a decision on the basis of which one is the most valuable. However, no one really knew whether value was actually being calculated, this abstract quantity of value was actually occurring in the human brain, and if so, where, until relatively recently. And it's only in about the past decade that neuroscientists, through painstaking experiments in monkeys, have determined that the human brain actually does calculate the abstract value of different options, for example, food. So I'm going to show you how that works here. This is actually a scan of my own brain, MRI scan of my own brain, so you can try to figure out why I have such bad spatial navigation. I don't know, it's in here somewhere. So basically the way this works is that there's a part of your brain called the orbitofrontal cortex, and I've highlighted that in blue here, and a nearby region called the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. And basically what these brain regions do is they collect information from other parts of the brain that inform them of the costs and benefits of each option. And so, for example, if it's dinner time and you're hungry and you want to go out to eat, there are neurons that are collecting information about the restaurant that's across the street from you, and there are neurons that are collecting information about the restaurant that's across town. So the restaurant that's across the street, it's not as good as the one across town, so the benefit is lower, but it's really close, so the costs are lower too. The one across town is really good, so high benefit, but it's a lot more time and effort to get there, and maybe the traffic's pretty bad, so the cost is higher. So your orbitofrontal cortex is independently taking these costs and benefits and calculating a value signal for each one of those options, and then comparing them to see which one overall is more valuable to you, the organism. And on this particular day, you don't really feel like fighting traffic, and so the one across the street is more valuable. So you've made a decision at that point, but how do you execute it? So at that point, your orbitofrontal cortex and ventromedial prefrontal cortex begins to activate other brain regions that are responsible for planning behavior. So these are cognitive parts of the brain that are figuring out, well, how do I get to this restaurant? I think I need to walk down the stairs, I need to open the door, I need to cross the street, I need to go to this restaurant. And then once that is planned out, how do you actually do it? You have to actually move your muscles to make this happen. And so those cognitive regions of the brain then are activating motor regions of the brain that are actually responsible for the nuts and bolts of figuring out how to move your muscles in the appropriate way to get you from your house to that restaurant. And so it's a cascading, sequential sequence of brain activity from decision making to planning and to motor functions that allows you to make decisions that deliver the maximum benefit to you and then carry those decisions out. So that's a basic idea. And now, if this system works how we think it does, then when it breaks, we should see pretty predictable effects. And there's actually, there are a couple different ways that you can experience damage to your orbitofrontal cortex. But the most common one is a disease called frontotemporal dementia. And this is actually a really common neurodegenerative disease. It's up there in prevalence, not far from Parkinson's disease. Most people haven't heard of it because it's very similar to Alzheimer's disease and is often diagnosed as Alzheimer's disease. But basically what you see in the brain of a person with frontotemporal dementia is they have degeneration of the orbitofrontal cortex first, and then that spreads to other parts of their frontal cortex, other parts of the cortex, and then more widely around the brain. So one of the things that's pretty interesting that you see in people with frontotemporal dementia is obesity. And this is kind of puzzling because, I mean, why would degeneration of a part of your brain that does something as abstract as computing value cause obesity? And the reason becomes clear when we think about the process that's happening as we're eating food. So if you're sitting in front of a plate of food, that first bite that you take has the maximum value of any bites of your entire meal because you're hungriest at that point. And as your meal progresses, your orbitofrontal cortex is constantly updating the value of taking the next bite of food. So the more full you get, the lower the value becomes of taking that next bite of food, and it gets lower and lower and lower until the value of doing something else, like getting up and clearing the dishes, is higher than taking the next bite. And then you stop eating. Someone with orbitofrontal cortex damage lacks the ability to update the value of taking the next bite of food. And so for them, every bite has the same value as that first bite of food. And so while you and I might eat until we're full and we stop, the person with orbitofrontal cortex damage will know that they're full. You can ask them and they will tell you that they're stuffed, but they will continue to eat because that signal of fullness is not being integrated into their decision-making process in their brain that actually generates their eating behavior. So let's take this information and see if we can apply it to to us, foraging in the urban jungle in the modern world. The first point I want to make is that, approximately speaking, the Hadza brain is the same as the brain that you and I have. The same economic principles that are hardwired into the Hadza brain that cause them to go for good deals are the same economic principles that are hardwired into our brains. So if we go back to the optimal foraging equation, we can look at how the benefits and the costs of food have changed in the modern world relative to the benefits and costs of food in the world of a hunter-gatherer. So let's see if we can see how they've changed here. So one thing, how have the benefits changed first? So the main benefit of food, as we've seen intuitively to the human brain, is its calorie content. If we look at the types of foods that hunter-gatherers eat, we have things like fruit, we have tubers, we have meat, we have nuts. These are all unrefined foods that have their natural fiber and water content, and thus they're less calorie dense than foods that have had those things removed. If we look at the modern diet, we still have many of these things available to us today. Many foods that are qualitatively similar to what a hunter-gatherer might eat. But that's not mostly what people eat. Mostly what people eat is foods that are where the calories of natural foods have been extracted and concentrated in the form of refined flours and sugar and oils, and then they've been combined into these various calorie-dense combinations. And there are a lot of healthy foods that are available to us as Americans. You can eat a very, very good diet in this country, but that's not what most people eat. And another point I want to make here before moving on is that the quantities are unlimited in our current diet. So while a hunter-gatherer, the quantity of food that's available to them, the quantity of calories is limited by the availability in a natural environment. For us, the calories are essentially unlimited. So not only is the food more calorie dense, but there's no limit to the amount that we can eat. And just to show you, I think when people who care about health get together, I think sometimes we lose sight of the way that most people eat, because the people in this room probably have a much healthier diet than most Americans. But in fact, the American diet is very focused on these refined calorie-dense foods. And I'm going to illustrate that by going through some data that I pulled from the report that was associated with the 2010 dietary guidelines. So what I'm going to show you is the top 6 calorie sources in the American diet. These are the foods that contribute more calories to the average American diet than any other food. The number 1 source of calories in the U.S. diet for people of all ages is grain-based desserts. So things like cake and cookies, brownies, donuts. And this, as you know, is this is a very calorie-dense food. This is a combination of refined, extracted calories in the form of starch and sugar and fat and oil. So that's number 1. That alone is pretty extraordinary to me. Number 2 is bread. Most people don't really think about bread as a calorie-dense food, but it actually is quite calorie-dense because as you chew it, the air in it goes away, and then it doesn't really occupy a whole lot of room in your stomach. It doesn't contain a lot of water, so it's actually a fairly calorie-dense food. Number 3 is chicken dishes, primarily fried chicken and chicken nuggets. Number 4 is sugar water, like soda and sports drinks. And incidentally, I'll believe they're sports drinks once sitting on the couch is recognized as an Olympic sport. Pizza, number 5, and number 6, alcoholic beverages. So alcoholic beverages are calorie dense relative to the default beverage of all of human history, which is water. So this, ladies and gentlemen, is the American diet. It's pretty extraordinary. And you can see that it's focused on these very refined, calorie-dense foods. So one thing I want to acknowledge before moving on is that hunter-gatherers did sometimes eat calorie-dense foods. It's not like they never ate calorie-dense foods. This is a historical image of an Inuit hunter who has killed a couple of whales. This is Kung San hunter-gatherer on the right with mongongo nuts. Nuts are a fairly calorie-dense food. So it's not like they never had access to calorie-dense foods, but they, in most cases, they had intermittent access to calorie-dense foods, and they didn't have access to them in unlimited quantities. And so the overall picture of us versus hunter-gatherers and non-industrial agriculturalists is one of much greater calorie availability today. So that's the benefits of food. Actually, one more slide on the benefits. The other point I want to make here is that, whatever your individual preferences are, you can satisfy them in the modern U.S. food environment. So the number of foods in the average U.S. supermarket in 1980 was already a staggering 15,000 food items. That number today is 43,000. So whatever is the food that is absolutely most valuable to your individual brain, you can get it in a modern supermarket. So the value of the food that we have today in terms of the calories and pretty much everything else is pretty much maximal. So now let's talk about the costs of food. Let's talk about the time and effort costs of food. And this is encapsulated in a concept that we're very familiar with, and that is convenience. So to illustrate the importance of convenience on our eating behavior, I'm going to go over the results of a study that was conducted by a man named Brian Wansink. And what he did was he recruited administrative assistants at his university, and he put dishes containing Hershey's Kisses in one of three different places in each of their offices. So either on their desk, within arm's reach, so all they had to do was reach out their arm, grab a Kiss and eat it, in the desk drawer, such that they had to open the desk, reach down, grab the Kiss and eat it, or across the room in a cabinet, such that they had to, get up, walk across the room, open the cabinet, grab the Kiss, and eat it. So each one of those had a progressively higher time and effort barrier, even though all three of the effort barriers were really quite trivial in the grand scheme of things. But despite that, it had a huge impact on their eating behavior. So the administrative assistants with Kisses on the desk ate 9 Hershey's Kisses per day. In the drawer, they ate 6. And in the cabinet, they ate 4. So just having this trivial effort barrier of having to get up out of your seat and walk across the room and open a cabinet already reduced their intake by more than 50%. So time and effort has a really, really big impact. Convenience has a really big impact on our eating behavior. And the food industry knows this. The food industry focuses, and we're going to get into this a little more later, they focus very heavily on the convenience of food. They know that that is one of the main things that drives our economic preferences for food. And there was a reporter who coined a phrase that I like to describe this study: candy on the desk is candy in the mouth. If you make it too easy for yourself, it's hard to say no. Okay, so we've seen that convenience can affect our food decisions. So how has convenience changed over the course of modern history? This is a graph that I like to show as often as possible. I think this is a really important graph that encapsulates a big part of how our way of interacting with food has changed over the course of the last century and a half. So this shows the percentage of our total food spending that we spend on food to be eaten at home versus away from home, including a little wedge that's been broken out here for fast food specifically. And what you can see is that in 1889, 93% of the food that we ate was food, of the food that we purchased was for consumption at home. So back then, people would go to the store, they would typically buy single ingredients, flour, meat, vegetables, fruit, etc., and then they would go home and prepare those ingredients into food for their family. Today, only about half of our food expenditure is on food to be eaten at home. Half of it is on restaurants, including fast food. So, and we're going to get back to this because there's more than meets the eye to this food purchased to be eaten at home in the modern day. But the main point I want to make here is that we have outsourced the time and effort of food preparation to professionals who are happy to do that for us for a fee. So we don't have to spend that time and effort anymore that it used to take for us to eat food. And probably the most extreme example of that is the meteoric rise of fast food consumption. In 1960, only 2% of our food expenditures were on fast food. Today, that's 18%. And this graph is kind of another way of showing the same thing. This is spending on restaurants from the National Restaurant Association between 1970 and 2010. This is in constant 2010 dollars. You can see that our spending on restaurants has increased by almost tenfold. So there's been a massive outsourcing of the time and effort cost of preparing food in this country over the last 40 years, over the last century, over the last century and a half. It's been a progressive process toward preparing our food less and less in our own homes. So the point, now I want to get back to the food that we bring into our own homes today. The point I want to make here is that even though we're still spending half of our food expenditures on food to be consumed in our own homes, a lot of that food is already pre-prepared. So we're not even preparing that food. We're buying things that are already ready and we're just bringing them home to eat at home. So the time and effort expenditure on the food that we're eating in our own homes is also much lower than it used to be. So while our grandparents for breakfast might have had, eggs and toast and a grapefruit, today we have Pop-Tarts. And while our grandparents might have packed sandwiches for their kids, today we have Lunchables. So the time and effort costs of eating food have declined dramatically in this country. And the processed food industry has been more than happy to indulge our innate economic preferences in that regard. So again, the cost of food, the monetary cost of food, is a representation of the time and effort that we put into earning that money. And people like to complain about how expensive food is today, but by historical and global standards, food today in the modern United States is incredibly cheap. So back in 1930, we spent a quarter of our disposable income on food, and today we spend about 10%. So not only has the convenience of food gone up, the time and effort costs have gone down, but the actual financial cost has declined dramatically. So if we take this back to the optimal foraging equation, what we can see is that the benefits of food in terms of the calories have gone up and the costs have declined dramatically. And so the overall value of eating food has gone up dramatically for us relative to people living in wild environment, hunter-gatherers, or non-industrial agriculturalists. Modern food is an incredible deal, and it's a deal that is very difficult for the human brain to pass up because of our hardwired economic preferences that motivate our eating behavior. So just as the instincts of a hunter-gatherer tell him to take advantage of food that's a great deal, our own instincts do the same. So most people, if they see a plate full of free brownies, they're probably going to chow down. So what are we going to do about it? I think there are a variety of things that we can do, both on an individual and a societal level. And to guide our thinking on this, let's go back to the optimal foraging equation. Are there ways that we can manipulate the instinctive economic value of food to the human brain in a way that will bring our calorie intake, that will help bring our calorie intake back down to a healthier level, and perhaps also increase the quality of our diet? And again, this is all about manipulating the benefits and the costs of food. So the first thing we can do as individuals is we can focus on lower calorie dense foods. So these are natural, unrefined foods that still contain the water and the fiber that unrefined foods naturally do. Things like tubers and meat and fruit and vegetables and beans. These are all foods that are satisfying and nutritious, but have a lower instinctive economic value to the human brain. And thus they help us control our calorie intake more easily. The second thing we can do is create small effort barriers to eating. So we've seen that even trivial effort barriers can have a really significant impact on food decisions. So one example of this that I like to give is the difference between having a bowl of shelled nuts on the counter and having a bowl of nuts with shells on. The bowl of nuts that you can just grab and put in your mouth are very easy to eat. But if you have to shell those nuts, you're probably not going to do it unless you're genuinely hungry, even though it's really not a very large effort barrier to do to, crack open a nut. And there are a lot of different versions of this same thing that you can use. The most extreme example that I think makes a lot of sense for the most problematic foods is to just not have them in your house. So if you really like ice cream, but you don't have it in your house, you have greatly reduced the economic value of eating ice cream, because to eat it, you have to drive to the store, buy the ice cream, drive back, and then eat that ice cream. That's a much lower value than if you had it already in your freezer. But there are smaller versions, less extreme versions of the same thing that you can enact, such as putting foods inside a screw-top jar. So like if you put nuts inside a screw-top jar and you have to open that lid before getting to the nuts, that's just a very small effort barrier that can help you make better food-related decisions. And then there are other things like putting food inside a cabinet or putting it inside a tall cabinet, maybe for certain foods that you don't want to eat very often, maybe even a cabinet that you can only reach by getting on a step stool. So there are different levels that you can use to basically shape your diet so that the right decision, the decision that you want to make, has a higher economic value than the decisions that you don't want to make. So the bigger and more difficult question is, what can we do as a society? And I think that there is a lot that we can do as a society if we have the will and if we have the courage. And I take a lot of inspiration from the changes in the prevalence of cigarette smoking in this country. So this is a graph of the number of cigarettes smoked per person per year in the United States between 1900 and 2006. And what you can see is that smoking prevalence increased rapidly through the mid-1960s, and then after that decreased quite precipitously. And in fact, it's about a 70% decrease from its maximum level to what it is today. And this has been a huge public health victory. I mean, we're talking about, if you look at the rates of cardiovascular mortality, of lung cancer incidence and mortality, if you look at the rates of serious pulmonary issues like chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, those things have all gone down dramatically because of the drop in cigarette smoking. This is a huge public health victory. So how did this happen? There are a lot of answers to that question, but it was primarily a large-scale public health effort on the state and national level to reduce the prevalence of cigarette smoking. And what tools did they use to do this? One of the tools they used was was interventions that affected the economic value of smoking cigarettes. So they basically increased the costs of smoking cigarettes. So one cost, obviously, is the amount of money that cigarettes cost. So when I was a kid in Virginia, a pack of cigarettes, you could get a pack of cigarettes for $1. Virginia is a tobacco, growing state. It's cheap there, but today it's $5 or $6 to buy a pack of cigarettes in Virginia. In Washington, where I live now, it's $9 to buy a pack of cigarettes. I mean, you have to practically be rich to smoke cigarettes these days. It's so expensive. So that cost has gone up, the financial cost. But the other thing is that, I mean, you can't smoke on airplanes, you can't smoke on campuses, you can't smoke in restaurants, you can hardly smoke in bars anymore. In a lot of places, you can't even smoke walking down the street anymore in a public place. So the convenience of smoking cigarettes has gone way, way down because of these regulations that restrict cigarette smoking in many different areas. And because of this reduction in the overall economic value to the human brain of smoking cigarettes, smoking has gone down. And there are other factors too, that's not the only reason, but smoking rates have gone down by, at this point, I think more than 70%. So that's pretty extraordinary. So food is not a drug, food's not cigarettes. You don't have to smoke, you do have to eat, but you don't have to eat junk food. And so how can you change the economic value of good food decisions versus bad food decisions? The most straightforward way of doing this would be to place a tax on unhealthy foods. And this is something that has already been implemented in some places. For example, in Berkeley, I know there's a tax on sugar-sweetened beverages right now. But the most notable example is in Mexico. So Mexico has implemented a high sugar beverage tax, and it's a fairly modest tax that has had modest effects on consumption. But it is a proof of principle that shows that when you reduce the economic value, it's really common sense. When it costs more, you buy less of it. It has a lower economic value to the human brain. So a lot of people have argued, well, this is kind of regressive and it hurts poor people who are just trying to get enough calories and put food on the table. And I understand that argument, but you know what else hurts poor people? Diabetes, obesity, cardiovascular disease. Those are huge scourges of the poor in this country. And so that's one of the answers I have to that. But the other answer is, we can take those taxes and we can subsidize healthier food. We can make it so that the overall cost of eating is the same, but that the cost, the cheapest possible diet is healthier than it used to be because the relative cost of different foods have changed. So there are ways to do this. And there are also ways to affect the convenience of food. So for example, in a lot of municipalities, there are restrictions on how close to schools you can sell alcohol and cigarettes. What if we said you can't sell junk food within a certain proximity to schools? That would reduce the economic value of those foods to children. So I think there are a lot of things that we can do if there's the political will and if we have the courage to implement them. But I would say that we've got to do something because we've got a huge problem and it's not going away, it's only getting worse. So I have a number of people I'd like to thank. First of all, the anthropologists who I interviewed as part of their work for my upcoming book, including Kim Hill, Brian Wood, Herman Ponser, Bruce Winterhalter, and Leslie Lieberman. These are people who helped me understand optimal foraging theory. I'd also like to thank Ellen Schur, Susan Melhorn, Mary Askren, and the UW Diagnostics Imaging Sciences Center. Those are the people who scanned my brain and helped me out in various other ways related to my book research. Thank you very much. Okay, go for it.
Okay, thank you, Stephan, for a really fascinating and thought-provoking presentation. While people line up for questions, also feel free to stand up where you are again and take a quick stretch break. Okay.
women went into the workforce, and you used to have someone who could cook foods from scratch at home all day, and now a lot of us can't do that. So how do we put that into perspective from your conversation about how our diets changed over the century, and then just on the whole with paleo or autoimmune protocol or anything where we're trying to make things from whole foods from scratch?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great point, and I think that's one of the fundamental drivers of the changes that we've seen in the way that we interact with food in this country. Family units just don't have as much available time to devote to making food as they used to. It's just a fact that more people are working than they used to. So that creates a fundamental, time deficit that is very difficult to overcome. Yeah, there's no doubt about it. And there's a reason. It's kind of hard to blame the processed food industry. They basically have filled a demand that people have because they have less time.
Yeah.
But the fact remains, I think a lot of people don't realize that they're doing a deal with the devil when they're eating those kinds of foods, that they're going to suffer quite a bit later.
Do you think there's maybe a book out there that could be devoted to how to make this part of your life specifically, not just an adjunct to recipes and what have you? Because I think that I'm on a lot of health sites, autoimmune and paleo and recipes and everything, and all these people, I swear, like a third of the conversation is, how do I do it?
So you feel like there's not enough information out there on how to make it time efficient?
How to fit, like batch cooking. How do I do that? How do I make that a part of my life? How do I make that a part of my schedule?
I mean,
when
honestly,
I go to the grocery store, how do I make the right decisions in order to make that happen?
I think that's a very important question. It's not really my specialty, but what I will say is that in my own personal life, I incorporate as much time-saving technology as I can.
Right.
So I have an electronic pressure cooker that I use extensively. I make big batches. I freeze things in my chest freezer. I use a microwave to cook potatoes and things like that. So I use as much technology as I can to minimize the amount of time and effort that I put into cooking wholesome food.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's about the best I have for you.
I think I'm just planting seeds with that last comment. Someone write a book or do the blog on that.
All right.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Very good.
Okay, thank you so much.
All right.